Welcome back. The stop work order at the U.S. Agency for International Development has already impacted some former vendors to the agency. Contractors say they're unsure what happens if the orders spread to other agencies. David Berteau is president and CEO of the Professional Services Council. He's former Assistant Secretary of Defense for Logistics and Materiel Readiness at DoD. Jerry McGinn is Executive Director of the Baroni Center for Government Contracting at George Mason University. He's former Acting Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base. Gentlemen, welcome. Thanks very much for joining me today. Dave, I start with you. The reason that I use the word former vendors at USAID is some of them are already out of business because of the stop work orders. What are people telling you in the vendor community about what they're seeing and what they're hearing and what they're worried about across the government today?
Francis, thanks for having me on. And there's really three dynamics that are working together here. One is the stop work orders for existing contracts, and I'll come back to what that really means. The second is the uncertainty about whether or not those contracts will turn into lifting the stop work order and going back to work, or a contract termination, which is a different dynamic than a stop work order. The third, and the most insidious and the less visible, is there are a bunch of invoices from prior work on those contracts before the stop work order was issued, completely in compliance with what the contract required companies to do. Those invoices have been submitted, the expenses have been paid, but they're not being reimbursed by the government. That's what's putting a lot of these companies at the thin edge of survival, because you've spent the money, you've paid the people, now you've got a stop work order because you can't get any more money, although you have to keep the people on the payroll because you may need to start up again at some point. It's a triple whammy for those companies. In addition, they may have a line of credit with a financial institution. Well, they're reading the same executive orders and then watching the same news shows that you and I are, and those banks are saying, I'm not sure you're the same credit risk you were when we put this in. So it's a triple whammy in place. We do have companies that are going out of business.
Jerry, welcome, and it's great to have you on the program. You hosted an event at the Baroni Center recently about what contracting looks like in the era of DOGE. What's your takeaway from both what you contributed and what your other thought leaders contributed at that event?
Yeah, no, it's great to be back with you, Francis. Thanks very much. That event, really, we got a lot of feedback from participants around the issue of, there's so much uncertainty that the DOGE is really about kind of the how it was established through executive order to actually help spend technology and IT spend better, is what the executive order was about. And that there's a reason why that is. $85 billion of our federal spend is on IT broadly, and that's the largest category of spend. So there's a lot of money, a lot of room for efficiencies. However, DOGE, all the headlines have been on the things that David has been talking about, the impact on workers, which has been significant. Lots of companies are unsure kind of where they're going and where the government is going. And there's also a lot of turbulence inside of government as well.
What does that potentially mean for an area like the Defense Industrial Base as you worked with when you were inside the building?
Yeah, well, I think if things continue at the current pace, we're going to dramatically shrink the companies that are under contract, and it's hard to see that being sustainable in any kind of way, because the government agencies can't function. But there's a lot of turbulence now. The question is kind of, what does the steady state look like, and then how do you? Because DOGE is actually about not only kind of tearing down or finding efficiencies, but it's about modernizing. There's a big software modernization initiative. What does that mean? Okay, how do you? And so there will be opportunities for companies to do things, but it's hard to see that right now.
The challenge, I guess, Dave, is that Jerry used a word that you've told me many times is anathema to the contracting community, and that's uncertainty.
Uncertainty, yeah, absolutely. Look at it, Francis. We're in a very unique transition from a government perspective, right? This is my 8th transition in Washington from one president to the next, but it's very different than any other. Why? Because President Trump was in office for 4 years, then left office for 4 years, then came back. You're seeing this across the board. Great preparation for what did we do last time? How did it turn out? Where did we succeed? Where did we fail? A lot of that interregnum of those 4 years spent getting ready for this one. So there's 3 big focuses there, and this is where I think the uncertainty comes in. Focus 1 is we got to cut. We got to cut people, we got to cut dollars, we got to cut programs. We want to do that in a way that is in alignment with the priorities, gets rid of the things that are not in alignment with the priorities. But now the second uncertainty is, what are the priorities and how do we keep in line with it? And even more importantly, when you get to implementing those priorities, you're going to need the competency and the capability and the capacity of the contractors to be able to help you move forward in that regard. So at the same time as you're tearing down a system, you have to maintain and sustain it as well. Paying the invoices is one of those pieces. It's over $700 million of unpaid invoices of money already spent. Maintaining the viability of the companies so that they can bid, win, and perform that work, and having a system in place that ties all those three together. Any one of those uncertainties is big enough. Add all three of them together, a lot of big question marks.
Jerry, you alluded to something a moment ago that I think is getting lost in the shuffle, and that is eventually, at some point, some of the things that are being torn down have to be rebuilt. There will be opportunities here also. This is not all terrible. Some people think some of it is, but not all of it.
Right.
What does that look like, and how do you advise companies to think about preparing for that time, being ready to leverage whatever those opportunities become?
Well, part of it lies in how DOGE was established, because prior to the inauguration, there was a big thought it was going to be an outside commission, a blue ribbon panel. That's not what the president did. He signed an executive order which created DOGE as part of the executive office of the president. It essentially took over what's called the U.S. Digital Service. And why is that important? So the U.S. Digital Service was stood up as a result of a little thing called healthcare.gov. Back in the kind of the prior administration, which was really kind of an IT and a website disaster. And so the idea was of the digital service was to bring in Silicon Valley, bring in commercial kind of software experts for short-term kind of stints to help advise agencies on how to be more efficient, more effective. So it's a natural place, actually home for DOGE, at least that it's chartered under to build efficiencies under the executive order. So eventually, as we were discussing, they're going to have to do some kind of build some and do the software modernization initiative. What does that look like? Is there a role for AI in acquisition? I think there's a lot of that. Are they going to look at things like types of contracts? The value of things is very different from today than it was in the 1950s when we set up the special cost accounting standard for cost plus contracts. Do we need that? Do we need things like the Truth in Negotiation Act that has lots of costs for companies and for government? So looking at those are ways that you can start to get after some of these efficiencies in time. But that's not happening now, but that's where I see sort of the next kind of wave on rebuilding kind of some of these efforts.
Dave, we have about a minute left. How does one look at potentially leveraging whatever opportunities exist in light of what DOGE decides it wants to do at some point?
Well, there are areas of the government we know contracts are going out and new work is being done. Defense obviously is a piece of it. All of the border security, and Congress is marking up this past week the Reconciliation Act for FY25 to increase border funding, et cetera. So there will be work there to be done. The best thing for a company to do is, how do I align my resources that I have, the people, the technology, the systems and processes in place, put those resources to focus on what the government needs going forward. There's a real interesting element of this in that typically we know what the government's going to be spending money on because they've submitted a budget to Congress. Congress is marking it up. Eventually the money's going to turn into contracts. Right now, that front end is an additional layer of uncertainty on top of that. We'll probably have to cover that in another show, though.
You always take me back to the budget, Dave, and I appreciate that. It's great to have both of you on the show. Thanks very much for joining me.